Welcome to another episode of Living Justice, Living Leadership. I'm your host, Lee Fisher, Dean of Cleveland Marshall College of Law at Cleveland State University. You know, I've had the great privilege to live my life at the intersection of the public, private, nonprofit, and academic worlds. As a lawyer, CEO of two nonprofit organizations, and as a state legislator, attorney general, and lieutenant governor. And the lessons I've learned come down to just two words: justice and leadership. That's why every week we'll talk to people who are walking the walk. Some are lawyers and some are not, but all of them have something in common. They are change makers. They are guardians of justice. They are living justice, and they are living leadership. Welcome to another edition of Living Justice, Living Leadership. I'm Dean Lee Fisher, your host, and I couldn't be more excited that our guest this week is Supreme Court Justice Michael Donnelly. He is the 160th Justice of the Supreme Court of Ohio. He took office in January of 2019 following his statewide election in 2018 to a full term on the court. Prior to joining the court, Justice Donnelly served as a judge on the Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas for 14 years, from 2005 to 2018, and before serving as a judge, he was an assistant county prosecutor from 1992 to 1997. He then went on to practice civil litigation for 7 years, representing plaintiffs and injured workers in asbestos legislation, at workers' comp, and personal injury. He's had a very, very distinguished judicial career. He served as chair of the Ohio Supreme Court's Commission on Professionalism. He is a member of both the Ohio State Board of Bar Examiners and the Ohio Jury Instruction Committee. He was appointed by the Chief Justice to the Ohio Supreme Court Death Penalty Task Force. He also, for 7 years, was one of 5 judges on the Cuyahoga County's Mental Health and Developmental Disabilities Court, which oversees criminal cases involving defendants who suffer from mental illness. He's a proud recipient of lots of awards, not the least of which is the William K. Thomas Professional Award from the Cleveland Metropolitan Bar Association. And here's an interesting fact that you wouldn't know otherwise. He serves on the board of the Cleveland Baseball Federation, so I'm guessing he knows a little bit about baseball, and we'll talk about that. That helps inner city boys and girls play baseball and softball in the summer at no charge. He's a graduate of St. Ignatius High School, John Carroll University, and the best law school in the United States of America, Cleveland State University's Cleveland Marshall College of Law, where he also will be inducted soon in the Hall of Fame later this year. He and his wife Nancy reside in Cleveland Heights. They have 2 children. Welcome, Justice Mike Donnelly.
Thank you, Dean Fisher. It's an honor to be here.
And tell us a little bit about that virtual background right there. What is that?
Okay, so my family and I took a trip to Ireland back in 2015, and we visited Trinity College in Dublin, and this is the law library. So I took this picture there because it was just so impressive, and I've used it in so many Zoom backgrounds, and a lot of people call me and say, "Can I have a copy of that?" So I say, "Sure," and I send. I've received the most compliments about this background more than any other.
Well, you know, I've always been impressed with our law library's background, but I have to say it's second to that background you've got. That looks like even a better law library than ours. I'm impressed.
It's old and beautiful for sure.
You know, I like to begin these interviews talking more about you as the person as opposed to judge or lawyer or prosecutor. So talk to me a little bit about your childhood, where you grew up, and tell us a little bit about your family.
Sure. I grew up on the west side of Cleveland. I have a late sister, Colette, who was 1 year younger than me. And then I have a younger brother, Tim, who is developmentally disabled. So we had 3 children, and we lived in Rocky River and had a wonderful childhood there, and ended up going to St. Ignatius High School, which I loved. I had a great experience there. And like a lot of people who graduate from Jesuit high schools, we ended up choosing. I went to Wheeling College in West Virginia for 1 year, and then I transferred to John Carroll University, where I ultimately graduated and immediately applied at the great Cleveland Marshall College of Law.
That's great. Now, I happen to know your father, who was a very distinguished judge. Tell us about him.
Yeah, my father, John Donnelly, he and my mom, Ellen, live in the city of Lakewood. He's now retired, but he was a longstanding probate court judge in Cuyahoga County from 1980 until our careers overlapped for 2 years. When I took the bench in 2005, he was still the probate judge, so we served together for 2 years, and then he eventually retired. But both my dad and my mom had a huge impact on my decision to go into law school and follow in his footsteps and follow this great career that has been more rewarding than I ever anticipated, thanks to Cleveland Marshall.
Did your dad ever think about running for Court of Appeals or Supreme Court?
No, I think he contemplated a position on the federal bench at one time, but I think a lot of people just were so happy with him at probate court because of the institutional knowledge that he developed over the years. And the way he ran that court, it was always a great experience growing up to have people come up to me and say, what a great judge my dad was and how fairly he treated people, and how helpful that court was. Because, when you find yourself in probate court and you're not familiar with the rules and the forms and all the regulations, he went out of his way to help people and to make sure that his staff adopted that philosophy as well.
I think that it's important for judges to realize that when they put on that black robe, they're still a human being, and to treat other human beings with kindness and compassion. And your father was like that, and frankly, you're like that too. And I think it's a very important thing for people to understand.
Yeah, thank you. I tell people that is probably the most important advice I received before taking the bench back in 2005. And I have to admit, I was a little nervous about the role I was going to be undertaking and the power of the position. And I had a discussion with my father, and he said, just remember, when you put on that black robe and you walk out into that courtroom, you represent something bigger than yourself. So it's very important not only to be fair, but to appear fair as well to everyone. And that I treated, and to treat everyone, no matter who they were, what role they were playing, prosecutors, defense lawyers, the defendant, victims, the public, with respect. And that's probably the best advice I ever received. I'm very proud of the fact that in 14 years, I never held any individual in contempt of court because of that advice. Because when you treat people like that, people tend to reciprocate.
I like that. That's a great story. I'm going to be having you speak to our law students later this year, and please make sure you remember to talk about that, because that's great. Tell us a little bit about your wife, Nancy, your children, and your family right now.
Okay. My wife, Nancy, is also an attorney, and she goes to that other law school. She went to that other law school on the other side of town.
Okay. We'll forgive her.
We're very fortunate to have two great law schools here. But we met when I was a young prosecutor under Stephanie Tubbs Jones. She gave me my first break after graduating from Cleveland Marshall, and Nancy was practicing civil litigation, and we were married in 1995. Nancy is in-house counsel for Steris Corporation out in Mentor, and has a lot of responsibility, and is just a great lawyer, and a great wife and mother as well. We're very proud. We have two children. My daughter Caroline is now a junior at the University of Dayton, and my son Tim just graduated from St. Ignatius, and he's going to be off to Ohio State in the fall. So
either one destined to be a lawyer?
Caroline is majoring in psychology at the point, and so she is contemplating law school, which I think she would be fantastic. So,
but the reason I ask is, that I start recruiting students when they're freshmen and juniors, so I'll be calling her after this podcast.
Oh yeah, that's no problem at all. I'm exerting what influence I have over her to make the right decision, go to Cleveland Marshall as well.
I want to talk for a moment about two subjects that you might not normally talk to an Ohio Supreme Court justice about. One is baseball, the other is music. Uh, let's talk about baseball first. You're on the board of the Cleveland Baseball Federation. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's pretty ironic because as a youngster, I had very little baseball skills at all, but I did enjoy the game and the dynamics of the game. But when I learned about the existence of the Cleveland Baseball Federation, um, I think I was right out of law school, and their mission, they're Cleveland's oldest charity, and their main objective is to raise funds so that the inner city children, boys and girls of Cleveland, can play baseball um, and softball free of charge. And I just think it's a very important um, charitable endeavor, because people learn so much from the game of baseball, playing the baseball, teamwork, so many lessons that goes beyond the actual uh, game itself. And so I've remained ever since a member of the board, and do what I can to support it every year. I think it does great work.
And the focus is on having young men and women be able to play baseball during the summer. Is that the idea?
Right, who would normally not be able to afford it. So the charity pays for all the uniforms. The coaching arranges for the coaching, the umpires, the fields, and it's been in existence for well over 100 years. So very proud to
That's
be
wonderful.
associated with it. Yeah.
Well, I've known you for a number of years, and I've always thought that outside of your love of family and the law, your greatest love might actually be music. I've seen you perform many times in a band, but many people don't know about your band. So tell us about that.
Well, thanks for asking. That is correct. Back when I was at Cleveland Marshall, I did contemplate um, possibly a career in music or entertainment law.
Hmm.
I just loved my favorite pastime back then when I was in my young 20s was going out and following bands. And I would go to different cities following some of my favorite bands. And ever since high school, I've just, been a true lover of classic rock and the Rolling Stones and the Beatles and the Who.
Hmm.
And so at some point, I think it was in high school, I picked up a guitar and started learning some chords, as they say, and just played all through college and through my 20s. And I would, be a star at various weddings. They'd ask me to come up and sing "Sweet Jane" by Lou Reed. That was my signature song. But it wasn't until you know the 2000s I ran into a lawyer and friend I know, Steve Zashin, and he told me about this organization called the School of Rock, and where adults could come in and meet other music rock-minded individuals and play music together. And I met some great guys at the School of Rock, and we went through 3 semesters of learning and playing out together. And one night we were sitting around and we said, I was 46 years old at the time, and I said, maybe we should form a band. And we all did. And 9 years later, we're still together. We came up with the name. Our bass player came up with Faith and Whiskey. And our motto is, if you don't have one, you better have the other. And, and we play, classic rock, but we have a rule when we select songs that has to be upbeat and something that people like to dance to.
Okay.
And we do a lot of benefits throughout the years. We've been fortunate to be invited to the Legal Aid Society's Jam for Justice every year, which raises money for the great Cleveland Legal Aid Society. And we're so proud to be a part of that. So we can have fun, do good things, and pursue our love of music as well. I always tell, when I'm invited to lecture at Cleveland Marshall, I always tell the students how important it is to have that life balance where you in order that you're able to pursue other hobbies outside of the law, and I'm proof that it can be done. We just had a concert last Saturday night, so I'm going to continue doing it as long as I'm physically capable.
And you do vocals and guitar?
Vocals and guitar.
And any other lawyers in the band?
Steve Zashin and Rich Wazorek is an IP lawyer as well. So we have three lawyers, insurance business, very varied background, but we all have a tremendous chemistry with each other.
That's
We
great.
practice once a week for about 2.5 to 3 hours. And
Wow, that's serious.
yeah, and it's great. It's great fun, and I couldn't be more fortunate to be with this bunch of guys. No one calls me judge or justice, and they don't care about that. Just as long as my instrument remains in key and my voice as well. So
I love that. That's great. And your favorite group of all time?
I'm going to throw two out there. I'm going to throw one. I would say the Stones is my favorite group, but I also in college used to follow a band called the Connells that are still around. They're from North Carolina. Not very well known in the United States, but they were big in Europe. Had a gold record, and because I used to follow them around, I've become friends with them over the years.
Huh.
And I go down to North Carolina and visit with them, and they still play great music. So if your listeners have never heard of them, I encourage you. They have a new album coming out this September, the Connells, and they are fantastic.
Okay, I'm glad this is a whole new piece of music trivia that most people don't know about, and I'm glad we broke the news here on this podcast.
Thank you.
Okay, let's talk about your legal career. Tell us your first year, a couple years outside of Cleveland Marshall Law School. What happened next?
Well, when I was a student at Cleveland Marshall, in my spare time, I would like to go down to the Justice Center and watch trials, and that's where I developed an interest of wanting to do courtroom work. And I met some great young prosecutors and defense lawyers and civil attorneys at that time. And I thought that's where I want to be. Right about the time I graduated from Cleveland Marshall, that's when my favorite movie, A Few Good Men, was released, and one of the greatest courtroom scenes of all time. And it had to have had an impact on me, because that's what I wanted to do. Even though the thought of standing up and arguing in front of a court is at the time caused me a lot of anxiety and nervousness. But the late great Stephanie Tubbs Jones had just become the prosecutor at that time, and I was very fortunate to be offered a position as an assistant. And before I knew it, I was doing what I wanted to do, standing in front of the jury and making arguments and fighting for truth and justice and just resolutions of criminal cases. So tremendous experience of 4 years there. Learned from a lot of great mentors, really ethical individuals that taught me the importance of fair play in the process, the importance of not hiding anything. Back when I first became a prosecutor, we did not have what we call open discovery in the state of Ohio, where prosecutors are now, fortunately, required to turn over all the police reports, witness statements, and evidence that, should the case go to trial, be used against the accused. And what would happen at pretrials, I would actually read the information from the reports and provide summaries of witness statements. And the defense lawyer would take copious notes, and they would have to trust that I was giving them all the proper information in order to properly represent their clients and form a defense or to weigh a plea resolution. And fortunately, a number of people, the defense bar in the state, stood up at some point, this was well after I eventually became judge, and said, this is just wrong. This is not fair. And they fought for open discovery. Fortunately, we had Regina Brett was championing the idea, championing in the plain dealer, and and people debated it, and there was opposition, and it was vetted, and they said this is the way we should go. And now it's looked at as one of the biggest advancements in our criminal justice system that has occurred during the course of my career. So it was a big teaching moment for me, because I began to think about the mechanics of the system and how it can be improved by providing greater processes that encourage transparency and efficiency, and form the basis for a lot of other ideas that I think still could make the system better than it is today.
Well, one of the signature parts of your judicial career is that you haven't just been a judge, you've been a reformer. And we're going to talk about that in a minute, because you've done it from lots of different angles. But I want to first understand how you transitioned from being a Cuyahoga County prosecutor to being a judge. Tell us about that.
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I consider myself fortunate that I didn't go right from the prosecutor's office to the bench. I went into civil litigation,
Right.
For about 6 years, and that exposed me to all sorts of different types of litigation, from personal injury, medical malpractice, as you mentioned, asbestos, mass litigation, mass tort litigation. And I did not plan it that way, but it exposed me to so many areas of law that eventually I would be exposed to as a common pleas court judge. And when in 2004, a seat became open on the common pleas bench, and it was being vacated by great jurist Bert Griffin from Shaker Heights. He had reached the age of 70, so he could not run again. And I was fortunate to have practiced as a prosecutor in front of him, and so his seat became open, and I decided that I would run for that. And I think at the time I developed a sense of where my talents would be best suited. I didn't like aspects of being an advocate, especially when I felt being asked to advocate for positions that I did not believe were supported by the facts in the case. These things made me very uncomfortable, and I thought I would be best suited as a decision maker that listens to both sides of a position and made decisions in that respect. And that's what kind of motivated me to want to run for a neutral position in our adversarial system as a judge. And I threw my hat in the ring, and I was fortunate to win that seat in 2004. And January 2005, I put on that black robe and started going out and doing the job. And to be quite honest with you, as I mentioned before, I was very nervous, because the power of the position of our trial court judges in this state is just so enormous. And when you're making such important decisions, especially in the criminal realm of whether to sentence people to prison, it was just overwhelming at first. But I'm glad, as I mentioned, I had that buffer, because by that time there were still colleagues that I considered friends in the prosecutor's office, but it wasn't like going straight from the office where all of a sudden you're in a position where you have to say no to some of your colleagues. So I didn't feel that pressure as much. Um, one story that I think your listeners would find interesting, that was very, I think, formative of some of my ideas later on, was as a prosecutor. Um, you know, I I was able to develop a sense that we always say prosecutors are there to seek justice and not necessarily a conviction. And I can remember having a case in which it was a robbery case based solely on one eyewitness's testimony. And case was coming up for trial, and there really wasn't much more that corroborated this case. That the identification had taken place 30 days after the robbery had occurred. And I met with the defense lawyer, and he told me that his client swore up and down that he had been the victim of misidentification and he had nothing to do with it. And as I approached the trial date, I remember talking with a colleague of mine, and I said, I'm having some second thoughts about whether we have the right person in this case just based on this sole identification. And back in those days, we didn't know, like we do now, about the unreliability of witness identification. And I remember my friend said to me, "That's not your job to question whether you have the right guy. He's been indicted. That's the jury's job. You get up there and you make an argument that you have the right guy, and you let the chips fall where they may." And I walked away from that situation, and I thought, I don't agree with that. And so I talked to a supervisor, young prosecutors, so to this day, it's still a fact that they don't have very much discretion in terms of what they can do with the case. Their decisions are made by supervisors, and fortunately, I had a very ethical supervisor, and I remember going to him and I said, I had a conversation with defense counsel. He swears up and down that his guy didn't do it. He thinks he could probably squeeze him into a misdemeanor plea, which would be a huge drop from the charge. But he swears he didn't do it. And I remember my supervisor grabbed the file. He took his big Sharpie pen and he wrote, "Dismiss."
Wow.
He said, "We don't prosecute innocent people." And I remember going up to the courtroom. It was Judge Ron Suster's room, and the defendant had been brought out. He had been in jail for probably 4 weeks or more. And I said, "We do not feel comfortable pursuing this prosecution because of the evidence not being able to rise to the level of beyond a reasonable doubt." And I said, "Case dismissed." And the defendant was ordered released. And I remember him looking at me and saying, "Thank you, I did not do this." And I said, "You're welcome." And I walked away from that with a really, just a profound revelation that, in a lot of respects, the design is great for testing the state's case, but we always have to be mindful of that in a system made up of humans, that mistakes can be made. And it came to form my true belief that the worst form of injustice that can take place in our system is convicting someone who is innocent. And I've committed all my efforts for the rest of my career to try and improve the system in that respect, for people who claim innocence, and to have a second look and have a system that values the truth over just finality of conflict resolution.
It's a wonderful story, and I'm curious to what extent you think prosecutors, even to this day, have the attitude of the person who told you that it was your obligation to prosecute and for the jury to decide, not your decision as to whether or not it's an appropriate case or not. To what extent does that opinion still prevail?
I think, I think when you have a system that is motivated, an adversarial system like we have, people want to win. And I think that's just that attitude will always be there unless we stay on top of our education efforts with prosecutors. You can see right now a wave of what they call progressive prosecutors being elected to office throughout the country, which is, I think, a great move. It's too bad you have to put a qualification on it, progressive prosecutors, right? Because really they should embrace the notion of adopting processes which, if someone is innocent, they should have a pathway that to have their case have a second look in the case, and they should embrace that notion of show us why this conviction lacks integrity, because for a number of reasons. You don't want the innocent locked up, and if someone who is innocent is locked up, that means the real perpetrator is still out there. So this is something that I believe prosecutors should embrace. I think the attitude is still there, but I'm optimistic that it's changing for the better.
Who was the supervisor?
His name was Ron James.
And what's Ron doing now?
I think he's retired. He worked for Congresswoman Marcia Fudge in Warrensville Heights for a number of years. Okay. But I believe he's retired. I haven't seen him, but that had a major impact on me.
Well, I want to give a shout out today to Ron James, because it sounds to me like he had made an amazing decision, and in some ways had a profound impact on you and your career.
Oh yeah, and there's so many in the prosecutor's office that were just like that. Steve Dever was a major mentor of mine, and look, I always say Steve was open discovery before it was open discovery. He was a major trial prosecutor, so he would let me sit second chair on cases. And when we went to pre-trials, Steve had enough clout in the office where he would just hand the file over to the defense attorney and say, go through it, and again, another moment in time that I didn't realize at the time, but as I look back on my career, just had a tremendous impact on my idea about fair play in this system and transparency.
You've been listening to the first part of my interview with Ohio Supreme Court Justice Michael Donnelly. This was such a fascinating interview that there's more, so stay tuned for part 2.